Okay, what I want to do is go over the reading more than a safe space, talk about the key points, and outline some of the major sort of contemporary relevant policy issues that are related to this topic. The objectives are for you to understand. Even though I put a lot of information sort of outlining the objectives, I really want you to know a little bit about the kind of context and history behind the Safe Schools movement, what that means in terms of policy, how that began and what it refers to, the argument of the author in relation to that idea of safety, and then we'll talk about related issues. Enumeration is another term that I want you to come away from this familiar with. To understand, again, contextually, like how Massachusetts and different states have played a role. Um, we'll talk about specific policy implementations in schools, like what schools are specifically doing in terms of GSAs, what they mean by safety and safe zone or those types of things. And then we'll talk about the Safe Schools Implementation Act, and to be familiar with those things. So, Michael Sadowski, the author of the piece, I just wanted to mention what we're reading is from an article. At this point in the semester, I like to keep the readings more condensed. Um, but this comes from a book. He was at Harvard for a period of time. He's now a professor at Bard College. He wrote a book on this topic, and so the article that we read is basically, a condensed version of what's included in his book. I like to point out, in some media outlets today, your generation is sometimes criticized in this idea of like the idea of safe zones or safe spaces or whatever. And I think that when some people use it, they mean it in a pejorative sense, as though like your generation needs an environment in which they're free from criticism or controversial ideas and things like that. That's not what we're talking about in this context. In this context, there's a lot of examples, and I will share on Canvas the Gleason National Research Survey, the number of kids who experience harassment, bullying, things like that. So, really, what this started as was a movement to make schools more safe, like literally caring about the safety of LGBTQ students. So it was a movement more to protect those students from actual physical harm. And again, I just think that's been translated sometimes in today into a kind of criticism or into a pejorative type of way. But what we're talking about is different. So I like to give the just quick kind of background. Even looking at into the context of recent policies, law changes, and Indiana. So Indiana, I don't even know how many years ago now, but around 2014, there was a movement to make a constitutional amendment to the Constitution of Indiana to make marriage specifically between a man and a woman. In Indiana, it was already, same sex marriage was already illegal at this time, but they wanted to amend the Constitution. That played out for a period of time. And what the reading refers to is then we had the Supreme Court uphold marriage equality. So marriage equality became the law of the land for Indiana. And I sensed, and I think other people sensed at this time, the direction the Supreme Court was going in. And to connect back to a reading, from earlier in the semester when we talked about Brown versus Board of Education, that again is part of that movement towards substantive equality. So the 14th Amendment of our Constitution indicates there's one group of rights holders. People can't be subjected to different standards of the law. Um, and so marriage equality was upheld on that basis of the 14th Amendment. And then it became a bit of a moot point here in Indiana, or, that federal law superseded Indiana law. As a quick note, after that, there was a bit of a backlash that happened in different states. Um, Mike Pence was sort of, when he was governor of Indiana, was part of a law. It was a Restore Religious Freedom Act, but it essentially, at least the way it was interpreted, opened the door for discrimination against the LGBTQ community. He was put under tremendous pressure. Initially he came out and said he wouldn't change the law. Um, a lot of states, or basically communities around Indiana, like Muncie is one example, um, rejected this movement in Indiana. Indianapolis, the Republican mayor of Indianapolis at the time opposed it. A number of even the NCAA, I think, indicated they would move out of the state. The Salesforce started putting up money for employees to move out of the state. Angie's List put a multi-million dollar project on hold. The NFL said they would no longer hold major sporting events in Indiana, or the Super Bowl, things like that. So there was a real national backlash against this law, and it was eventually amended. Um, there's I there are always different incidents that happen, kind of around the country, and then in our state. This was a teacher, a female teacher, and this was from a private school, but she was fired for having a same sex partnership, for having I think she was married. For being married to her wife. She was on the Ellen show. Ellen profiled her and talked about her, and it was a national story for a short period of time. And I honestly don't know the outcome. I don't think she was actually liked at the school. But yeah, she ended up being fired for her sexuality, and that's an issue we'll talk about really briefly. But I also like to mention, our country's first uh, major nominee for president came from Indiana, from South Bend, Indiana. Pete Buttigieg. His husband is a teacher at a private school in Indiana. Um, so yeah, no, I think that's, in general around the country, there's a bit of a mix, or there's kind of a complicated shift going on. And so, in the one hand, like as one example, you have marriage equality is the law of the land, but you also have a number of states where um, if same-sex couples, the LGBTQ community is vulnerable in areas like housing and employment. um, like in Indiana, you could be denied housing, you could be kicked out of your house, or denied housing, or fired from your job, basically on the basis of your sexuality, um, without explicit legal recourse. Um, so, and I think most people misunderstand that. Now, federal employees are covered under specific federal laws, but in the state, there are no specific protections. So, as a group, the LGBTQ community is so vulnerable in a number of ways. One of the other things that I like to sort of reference, that again I think relates to our reading and sort of emphasizes this, are what are known as no promo homo laws. And these are laws around the country. And I posted a video on the Canvas site under this week related to this topic. I hope that you'll watch it. It's only about 3 minutes long. But a number of states have laws that specifically forbid teachers from talking about, or basically presenting homosexuality in a positive light, in any kind of positive way. And each state is a little bit different. But I have to say, I have read some of the law, the wording in some of these laws, and it is pretty jarring. I think most people would be surprised to read that states have laws like this. And I want to mention, Utah was one state that did have such a law, that I believe has actually recently repealed it. Um, so that's one of the things I wanted you to be familiar with. So teachers are actually forbidden um, from talking. I mean, in some of the states, from talking about LGBTQ issues. Though I would say, like, if you end up teaching in one of these states, there are ways, I think, to positively communicate and connect to students. And I don't think that those laws necessarily represent in any way the broad base of educators and schools in those areas. This is safe school laws. The darker green would tend to have again like safe school laws, or well, and we'll get into this, but we'll talk about enumeration and our more enumerated states. The other ones are the lighter color do not have laws or do not have any explicit policies, are not in a sense not enumerated, and then the orange here on the map would be ones similar to what I just talked about, have laws actually or policies forbidding discussion of LGBTQ issues or presenting the LGBT community in a positive, in any kind of a positive light, or talking about it, normalizing it, those kind of things. So enumeration, I want you to be familiar with, and essentially this simply means that a school has a policy or a plan by which they'll act to protect vulnerable groups. It doesn't relate specifically to LGBTQ students. It could relate to individuals with disabilities. It could relate to religious minorities. It's just a kind of a way in which schools are proactive, that they have a plan in place, that if a kid's being harassed or in some way, the school has a way in which they'll act, or a chain of command. So as teachers, you would know who to go to, who to report things to, and then that person would have a plan and action in place to deal with it. In terms of LGBTQ students specifically, this goes back to Massachusetts. It began at the end of the 1980s, going into the 1990s. It was initially like a safe school kind of program, and that kind of evolved over time. But that was the first state to begin to enact policies. And two things I want to mention about enumeration from the reading, but that I've also seen, again, related to the research. And that is one, that schools that are enumerated do have a specific drop in, or have less incidents of physical violence, harassment, all those types of things. So enumerated states, enumeration is shown to reduce harassment, bullying, and violence against the LGBT community. Here's from the Gleason National Survey I took. This is Indiana data that I've presented in these three slides. So you can see that that Indiana does have high rates. The LGBT community in Indiana does report really high rates of, as you can see here, the light blue is verbal harassment, the slightly darker blue here, physical harassment, and then physical assault in the darkest blue. And so that's 27%. Around sexual orientation, you can see 27%, 49%, and as high as 85%. So again, Indiana is not enumerated. Some school districts in Indiana do have some policies or have different programs in place, but by and large, most school districts don't. And you can see here comprehensive policy less than 1%, or relative to 1%. I do think this is a positive sign. 95% of students report a supportive educator, meaning a teacher. Many supportive educators, though, is unfortunately still low at 43%, a GSA around 22%, inclusive curriculum at only 9%. And so I thought I'd mention, like, in contrast, I have a doctoral student right now who is doing her dissertation, and she's researching California public schools. And they're new because they passed the law a year ago, requiring LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, and so she's kind of doing her research on that policy, and then how that policy is playing out in California schools. So I'll be really interested to read her final dissertation, and she's focusing on teachers and the perception of teachers following that law. Uh, so one of the impacts of of the harassment and issues that we see, I think more generally, are a large number of homelessness within the LGBTQ community. I had a friend who ran a homeless shelter in Colorado, um, and he told me this was an issue. And I've talked to a number of other people's. Miley Cyrus, as a quick side note, has donated money to an organization and done a number of fundraisers for an organization that deals with LGBTQ homelessness. Suicide is also a significant problem. And so the data I'm citing here is between 30 to 40% in terms of attempting suicide, but 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And this is the data that my understanding consistent with the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the national organization, their data. And when in the CDC, reports and findings on this is that basically one of the major things that can be done would be schools changing policies again to have those kind of proactive enumeration policies that would deal with the bullying, harassment, and things like that. So one of the graphic organizers that I put in here talks about safe zones, safe spaces, gay straight alliances, and anti-bullying programs. And I'll kind of walk through these really quickly, but I do want you to be familiar. Like I do want you to know what a GSA is, to have a general understanding of a safe zone, and to be familiar with some of the anti-bullying programs. One of the things that I want to mention from the reading, and this is my own kind of feeling in relation to the anti-bullying, kind of discussion that's been happening, is that the author points out that the problem with this is sometimes bullying becomes this really broad term, and that sometimes what we're talking about when you're talking about bullying is general name calling, things like that, but sometimes other things like physical harassment, physical assault, things like that get kind of lumped together under the context of bullying, and that's a real problem. The author sees that as a real problem, and that's something that I want you to be familiar with. Sometimes the problem with anti-bullying programs is that sometimes they really include other, criminal kinds of activities like violence and assault and things like that under this context in a way that really minimizes them. So again, and a general point is that when different school districts like Massachusetts and Iowa and those mentioned in the readings implement though enumeration and policies, those states and schools do see a decline in harassment, violence, and those types of things. All right. So safe zones here, a safe zone program. I don't know that there's. Again, I think it's something that gets mocked in contemporary society. I did the safe zone training at Ball State. I have the marker up in my office. I think it's just in a way teachers and schools trying to send a message that they are making a concerted effort, or that they do care about LGBTQ issues, and that they are trying to send a message of inclusivity and concern about those issues. I don't think it's any major. It's like when you go to the safe zone training, you're not like qualified suddenly to be, to do counseling or anything like that. It's just the safe zone programs are generally set up so that you learn a little bit about the issues. And I will say one of the things that was really impactful for me was hearing about some of the experiences directly from LGBTQ students, their experiences, and then it's just making a commitment to be inclusive and caring, and those types of things. And I thought I would mention this is kind of the general marker, and that triangle that's used, the pink triangle that's used in LGBTQ advocacy is from the Holocaust. So LGBTQ people in the Holocaust were marked with the pink triangle, and so they've adopted that as a symbol of advocacy and resistance. Um, I always like to mention too. GLSEN is the Gay Lesbian Straight Education Network. It's a national organization, but they do have an office in Indianapolis, and it has a lot of great resources that you can go to. I put the link up on the slide, but there are a lot of great resources for teachers, um, and administrators and other school officials to utilize. So a GSA is another thing that I wanted to mention. Generally, when I ask classes like how many students had a GSA in their school, um, it gets kind of mixed. I guess once or twice I've asked, and about half of students have indicated that they had a GSA, and then sometimes I've asked, and maybe one or two raise their hand. But most students don't know what a GSA is. I think the majority of students, since I've talked about this topic, do not know what a GSA is. But it's a gay straight alliance, and it's just an extracurricular organization. Um, Again, I don't think there's anything major or significant. I mean, they're not that different in so many ways from any other extracurricular group. Um, at times there might be in some ways some level of engagement or advocacy these groups do. Like for example, one activity might be um, a day of silence, where they talk about sort of remembering the number of people who've been killed, those types of things. Um, but by and large, it's just a way for people to come together and create a sense of community and support. Um, the idea is obviously here to that it welcomes all. Ball State's GSA is Spectrum, and I think they changed it, but the slogan used to be "Just because you're here doesn't mean you're queer." Um, and so again, it was just open to all students, regardless of sexual orientation, um, as a way to build a community and things like that. And then again, it sometimes some levels maybe of advocacy and engagement. Um, I would say that GSAs generally are. I think when I've talked to administrators about this issue, they tend to be more fearful. They sort of over anticipate the negative reaction to GSAs, and they'll sort of do this dance where it's like, well, I don't really, um, have anything against them, but they, worry about how people might react to it and those types of things. But I think once they become, and I've asked students too who've had them in their schools, and they seem to indicate too that maybe there was a reaction to it initially, but once it's incorporated within the school, no one, it just doesn't become that big of a deal, or it's not an issue, or people, um, it doesn't create like ongoing problems. And the research indicates that schools with GSAs do have fewer incidents of harassment, violence against the LGBT community. Um, Again, which could be correlation less than causation, um, but in general, they do appear to be positive organizations that have a positive impact. Um, there's a list of GSAs and information. Um, if schools allow extracurricular activities, they have to allow for a GSA. And to give you an idea of how resistant some schools have been, some school districts literally got rid of all of their extracurricular activities, all their other clubs, everything just to get rid of the GSA. That happened in Indianapolis and Franklin Township, and a judge over ruled against the school district and said the school had to allow the GSA. And then the school had obviously a problem finding a teacher to. That's one of the things is that GSAs need to have a staff member sponsor the GSA, and sometimes that can be difficult. So it's just finding a sponsor and then just starting a club like any other club. I thought I'd mention PFLAG really quickly. This is a little bit outside this initial context, but just I mean the it really started with a great. I mean, it's a great story. It was a mother of a young man who was arrested, and she realized her son was being persecuted by the police at that time, and she started this organization, Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gay Youth. And it's a national organization. There are obviously chapters within Indiana. And again, it's just a way that friends and family of people within the LGBT community can show support and be aware of um, civil rights issues and things like that. All right, I feel like I have a lot of, just as a quick side note, slides in the PowerPoint that relate to a prior reading. So I used to use a different reading for this topic. And obviously, you're not required to be familiar with any of that, but I do want to mention that in this reading, it did have the voices of LGBT students, and and one of the things that really resonated and that came across was how many of these kids actually survived because they had a supportive teacher. It was they cited their teacher as the one that helped them through to kind of get through the difficult time period. I think we all know adolescence obviously is as difficult enough, in general, but for LGBTQ youth, it's in particularly challenging. And these students really cited a teacher, and that's one of the reasons that, to relate back to employment coverage, that I think one of the things states could do is if they made sure they protected LGBTQ teachers, and teachers knew that they couldn't be fired or let go on the basis of their sexuality, it would allow more teachers to be kind of open and comfortable doing things like supporting GSAs, supporting students, and things like that. So, and another thing that I want to mention to you is I'm hoping, so that you understand contemporary issues. I posted a video on Canvas that's trans youth, titled Trans Youth. It's done by Vice News. And I've asked that you watch the first 9 minutes, and not because it details a specific young trans student, and then that little girl's mother and her plight in Texas. And it does get into the school. It ends kind of where you see what's going on in schools, and it shows a clip with the Texas school board. And that too is something that I'd like you to be familiar with. Again, if you're inclined, you could watch the whole segment, which is about a half hour. But I really, related to schools, would hope you'd watch the first 8 to 10 minutes of that. So, and again, I think just going back to the reading, I would recommend that you to go through the reading. And in addition to some of the information I've mentioned, it does point out like the number of students who have limited access to LGBTQ, you know, uh, curriculum and positive representations and things like that in schools, and for you to be familiar with that. And I would just mention, I don't think it's always too a question of um, creating new things. I even think about, if in so many topics, whether it's Alan Turing in relation to math, or um, different playwrights and individuals in the context of English, I feel like the information a lot of times is already there. It's just a matter of, creating a kind of context in which you can talk more openly and honestly about it. So I hope this helps, and helps clarify at least some of the key points.